This is Rebel Therapist, a podcast for entrepreneurs who are trained as therapists and who want to level up their businesses, make a bigger impact, feel fulfilled, and be very well paid. I'm your host, Annie Schusler. This here podcast has changed a lot since it started in the spring of 2017. If you've been listening that whole time, you've noticed. My business has grown a lot, largely thanks to this podcast. I started this as a way to reach more therapist entrepreneurs and to give you inspiration and information about growing your business. I've found my voice more and more over the last 3 years. I have learned a ton about podcasting, and I've discovered that I love it. I've also gotten to support some of my clients in creating their own podcasts. Here are a few things that I've learned about podcasting. You have to love your podcast. It can't just be for marketing purposes. If it is, you'll be bored. You won't grow an audience and you won't stick with it. You have to have a specific listener in mind. Even though your podcast is probably free, it helps to think of it as an offer within your business that gives real value to the listener. If your podcast is part of your business, you need a clear connection between what the podcast offers and what people can pay you for. The more clear and logical that connection is, the better. Finally, your podcast has to be unique. That means you need to find your voice and provide value in a unique way. I'll talk a little bit about that last point and how that's worked for me. I realized right away that I would need to figure out how to create something different. For me, that difference comes from interviewing folks about their own businesses instead of interviewing business experts who are going to tell you what to do. If someone's not open to talking about what's happening behind the scenes in their own business, they're not a fit for the show and they don't get an invite. I myself am a business expert who tells people what to do at times, so I'm not against that. But for this podcast, I like to give you examples of folks who have created their own innovative and successful businesses. When you want to hear from business experts, I know you've got no shortage of podcasts to listen to. The podcast that I was a fan of that made me want to take that approach was the Get Paid podcast by Claire Pelletreau. It's a more general online business podcast, and she asks people nosy questions about how much money they make and what's working for them. I've also learned a ton from the book So You Want to Start a Podcast by Kristen Meinzer, and I highly recommend that too. Okay, enough about me as a podcaster for today. I'll share more about my own lessons learned for sure, but for now, I want you to hear from some other fantastic entrepreneurs. You're going to hear from 5 Rebel therapists who dare to podcast. They're all leaders in creating unique and valuable podcasts. Introducing Asher Pangeris, Bianca Hughes, Dr. Kelsey Harper, Marielle Berg, and Nick Venegoni. Each of them is sharing with us who their show is for, what it gives the listener, one thing they've learned in the process of creating their show, and how their podcast supports their business. Let's start with Asher Pangeris, host of Living in This Queer Body.
Hey everyone, this is Asher Pangeris, and I have a podcast called Living in This Queer Body, a podcast about barriers to embodiment and how our collective body stories can bring us back to ourselves. And I have this podcast in part because I did a course with Annie, a Rebel Therapist course, and was really helped in terms of thinking about how to supplement my psychotherapy practice with something that felt more generative and creative for me as someone who is trained as a social worker. I think we're trained into a kind of competence model where we can work with anyone and we can make, anything work. And I can work in a clinic or a hospital and I think for me, what was so rewarding about working with Annie, and also has been rewarding about having this podcast, is that it allows me to really talk to and have the conversations with people that I am inspired by, that I'm curious about. I feel similarly about many of my patients, but I think that having this outlet has been really invigorating. The podcast is really about what are the barriers to queerly bodied people. And I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. You know, what are the barriers to us? And I include myself as one of them, as someone who's queer, who's a parent, who lives with chronic illness. What are the barriers to us kind of being able to access our bodies and bring our bodies along when we've experienced a variety of difficulties and systemic oppressions? And so it's a interview-based podcast, and I get a chance to talk to people who I really admire, which is cool. And I think it really helps me feel like I have a balance between the more long-term intensive psychotherapy work that I still do and really deeply, deeply care about and am committed to. And the podcast has allowed me through both, the platform of the podcast, which is mostly available wherever you find podcasts, but also the platform of Instagram has allowed me to kind of connect with people that I wouldn't normally be able to work with, because I live in New York State and can only practice in New York State as a psychotherapist. So I've been able to host and do regularly host workshops. They're done virtually, so I can work with people from all over the country and world, and I do. And I think that has been probably the most fulfilling part of this podcast process, has been really feeling like there are isolated queers, there are people who are lacking in community, there are people who really share similar experiences, such as, one of the more powerful workshops I did involved addressing the issue of healthism and nutritionism, and how ideas around wellness culture have impacted our queer bodies in different ways. And we all everyone in the workshop really needed to talk about this and really felt isolated in their experience. And we had people from Canada, people from all over the country tuning in. And so I think that has been something that I didn't know I was missing, but something that I really deeply appreciate about this project and hope to do more of that. I have pretty regular monthly workshops that you can find out about on Instagram, or when you listen to my podcast, I usually make announcements. The podcast comes out every other week. And right now I am doing a program intensive called Embodied Testimony, and I probably will host that again next year. It is a 3-month-long intensive to kind of go deeper into some of these questions. And I thank you, Annie, for helping me make this podcast and this project possible.
Now we'll hear from Bianca Hughes, host of Authentic Wednesday.
Hello, my name is Bianca Hughes, and I am the host of the Authentic Wednesday podcast. On the podcast, each week, my guests and I share our vulnerable behind-the-scenes stories of giving ourselves permission to take off our masks, let go of expectations, and embrace our own path of freedom and authentic connection with ourselves, our loved one, and the world. This podcast I always say it's my baby. I never thought I would be so happy to have this podcast. It has turned into so much more than I thought it would turn into. My podcast is for anyone who is really wanting to hear other people's story of what it means to live a life of authenticity. If you're someone who loves to hear stories, and you'll definitely hear an authentic, vulnerable slice of life. There is one week where I'm sharing and another week where I'm interviewing my guests. And from this, people generally get a sense of being able to relate, realizing they are not alone, and just giving themselves permission to really be their authentic self. This is really the whole flair of doing the Authentic Wednesday podcast, is that it's giving other people permission to be authentic, giving other people permission to connect to their authentic selves. I really wanted to start this podcast as I love asking thought-provoking questions. Always thought that I would do a podcast, didn't know what it was, and Authentic Wednesday came about as I would do Authentic Wednesday videos, just being relatable as a therapist on Instagram. And so I changed it to a podcast, and it has been just overwhelming and just really good, and overwhelming in the sense of the response from people and just people really enjoying it and sharing it and having the interviews. I also thought it would be another good way to kind of get my work out there and what I do out there, not just as a therapist, but also for my Permission to Be You and Thrive program, which is for Black Christian women, really wanting to have more connection with God and with themselves and thrive in what God has called them to do and who God has called them to be. Although that is a big part of what kind of pushed me as well to do this, it really is open for everyone. Although I think this is one area of my work that I definitely share more of myself as being a Christian in more of any of the work that I do. But anyone can listen. I have all sorts of people actually on the podcast. I will say that this has really taught me this podcast is, like I said, is my baby, and it's really taught me to reassess where I am, where I'm going, what I'm doing, in the sense of it does take a lot of work. So it's assessing, do I need to do this? Do I need to hire an editor? Do I need to hire someone to do another part of my business? So it causes me to honestly reassess probably monthly in what I'm able to do and be really gentle. There was a time where I just could not produce an episode. It was my week, so it was fine. So I didn't. And so it gives me that freedom to really assess where I am and not overdo it. And I guess hold myself accountable for the things that I talk about myself. And so that's one thing I do love, but it is definitely my baby. I definitely listen back to the interviews a second time when I edit, and I love them the second time. They're even more great. I have listened to myself and actually love my voice and love how I speak and love what I have to say and to share. Sometimes I know it can be cringing. I feel like, what did I say this time? But I go back and I listen and I really do. I love the content. I always tell people, if you want to hear my work or do the work or things I do, definitely listen to the podcast. So I hope you listen to the podcast, and just if you have any questions, just let me know.
Now we'll hear from Dr. Kelsey Harper, host of Warrior Girl, which is launching soon.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kelsey Harper, and I'm a clinical psychologist in Los Angeles, California. The name of my podcast is Warrior Girl. This podcast was designed specifically for survivors of sexual assault, and it's intended to really bring to people a very candid and authentic conversation about all the different things that are concerning survivors. It brings on a bunch of my friends, my family, my trusted colleagues, and other trusted experts to discuss things about sexual assault, like coping skills, self-care, trauma recovery, social relationships, friendships, as well as any other topic that really is important, things that are in the news, rape culture, social media, stuff like that. The intention of this really is to open up a conversation in a community where people can discuss something that we don't usually get to talk about, even in the Me Too movement where people are talking more and more about it. Survivors are still feeling an intense amount of need to stay safe and protected. And that means that these conversations are happening in the background or in private rooms and spaces like that. And that also means that some survivors are not able to find each other and really be able to build community with each other. And so this podcast links to that bigger purpose of really being able to help build community and connection among survivors, but also to provide that voice that can say, you are seen, you are heard, we too have experienced this and we are here for you. What made this really important to me was when I was in early recovery from my own trauma, my own assault, I noticed that I was having a really hard time connecting with other people, with different resources, and was having a hard time just finding anything and felt incredibly alone in my process and in my recovery. I felt like there wasn't anybody to talk to. Nobody had anything to say to me about what made this particularly unique. And so this podcast is to offer a free space for people to really get connected to that and to hear some voices about this particular topic, about recovery, about how to build a life, and about how to move forward. In addition, part of this podcast is really social justice targeted in its nature, in the sense that the more that we speak about something, the more that it becomes something that's out there in the world, and the more that we can change it. And so wanting to bring more and more justice to this and wanting to ultimately end sexual assault. So how this podcast really fits for me and my business is that I have a bigger, larger paid offering that podcast listeners can sign up for. And that's my coaching programs, that I have online virtual coaching programs where listeners can go through an 8-week process where they can learn a bunch of different coping skills, do a bunch of different practices, tap into their intuition and their wise parts of themselves, and really learn how to re-engage in their world. And this is really designed to complement formal trauma interventions and treatment. And so this is a post-treatment or post-recovery intervention to help people get connected and launched out into their world. And I have 2 programs there. There's From Survivor to Warrior, which is how to rebuild yourself and feel more sense of power and self-respect. And then there's From Warrior to Sage, which is how to get connected more deeply to meaning and purpose in your life. Really connect to what it is that you're wanting to do. And so the podcast really helps build an audience and really connect people to those programs and let them know that they're there. When I was a survivor, I had no idea what was out there and found out that there was barely anything. And so this podcast is to help direct people to that. And it also is directing people to other community services that are out there so that people can get the help that they need. But it's also a really nice free offer that anybody can engage in from anywhere that they are. If they're still in their cave, they can just press play and still connect to a community of people that are there for them, if they need to. One of the things that I learned in the process of creating this podcast, I think the biggest thing was that, as Glennon Doyle puts it, I can do hard things, that this is something that I didn't have any of the concrete skills for. I had no idea how to record a podcast, an episode, how to edit. I'm still learning how to edit, but also I didn't have as much confidence in my voice, in the part of me that feels authentic and genuine here versus like being overly clinical, and my comfort zone. And I really was reaching far into trying to be very genuine and raw and real here. And in that sense felt very vulnerable around this. And that felt like a very hard thing, like to be very open and vulnerable, to start to connect with my own people around believing in my business and believing in my message so that they could be on this podcast. And I learned that that's actually something that I can do, that I can make something happen. And that has been a huge motivator that has really helped me with moving forward with all parts of my business, of that, I can do hard things. People believe in me. This is something that people want, and that my voice is worth listening to. And I think that's one of the most valuable things that I've gained from putting together a podcast.
We'll get to our final 2 podcasters in just a moment. If you want to create your own rebel business beyond a traditional private practice, I am here to help. Create Your Program is a 5-week small group and one-on-one coaching process to help you create and launch your signature program. You'll identify your niche, create your pilot program, and design a marketing plan to grow your audience. Maybe in that process, you'll decide to create your own unique podcast as part of your Rebel business. I'm taking applications until June 17th, 2020. We've got a few spots left as I'm recording this. Go to rebeltherapist.me/create to learn a lot more about it and apply. Now we'll hear from Marielle Berg, the host of 2 podcasts, the Skillful podcast and It's Just a Cookie.
My name is Marielle Berg, and I have 2 podcasts. So the first one is called the Skillful podcast, and that podcast is connected to my in-person small group therapy practice in the San Francisco Bay Area that focuses on both DBT and couples therapy. And that podcast is really important to me because I get to talk about DBT skills with primarily my colleague who works with me at the center, and I get to spread the word about the usefulness of these skills. And then my other podcast is called It's Just a Cookie, and that podcast is for people who are struggling with food and body image issues, and it uses a health at every size and intuitive eating lens to help people heal from eating disorders, disordered eating, and just general kind of food and body angst. And that podcast is really important to me because I get to interview really interesting people, dietitians and other therapists and activists and critical thinkers who have a lot to say about how people relate to their bodies and food concerns and weight concerns. That podcast fits into my Rebel business where I offer online coaching, and it is supporting me in building an audience for a future online coaching program. So I've learned many things in the process of creating these podcasts, and my initial thinking was that I would release each podcast twice a month. So that would be 4 podcasts a month, which I didn't realize at the time means that I'm releasing episodes weekly. So one thing I learned is that that is too much for me while I'm also working full-time in my private practice. So I have since scaled back and I'm trying to figure out what will feel more manageable and sustainable in the long term. And I think that therapists are uniquely suited to doing particularly interview style podcasts because we are so used to asking questions and being curious and listening closely. So that has been a really pleasant surprise as I've been on this podcast journey.
Finally, we'll hear from Nick Venegoni, host of Queer Spirit Podcast.
I'm Nick Venegoni, and I'm the host of the Queer Spirit Podcast, which is a show for spiritually minded queer folks on a path of personal healing and transformation. On the show, I have one-on-one conversations with artists, healers, and activists about the ways they support the LGBTQ communities to thrive. I started this podcast because I really wanted to share the wisdom of alternative health and spiritual practices which have supported me on my path as a queer person and as a healer. So I bring on guests to talk about the work that they do to share with listeners who might normally not be exposed to these ideas or practices. For example, I've had filmmakers, authors, and comedians, as well as herbalists, tarot readers, and ancestral healers. I even did one solo episode where I shared my healing journey with cancer. As I navigated my own healing, I worked with an acupuncturist, a homeopath, a hypnotherapist, as well as Western doctors for surgery and chemotherapy. It felt really important to me to be vulnerable with my listeners about my own struggles, to let them know they are not alone in their own health challenges. And it was especially important to share it from the perspective of another queer person because we don't really hear those stories in the mainstream media. From a business perspective, my idea for starting the podcast came when I wanted to take an in-person workshop, which I had developed in the Superpower method with Annie, and turn it into an online course. I realized that I needed to have a broader reach outside of my geographic area. I had tried blogging, but I wasn't motivated or disciplined enough to sit down and write as much as I needed to. I spoke to a few friends and colleagues who had started their own podcast and thought I'd give it a try. I figured that interviewing people on a show wasn't much different than talking to clients in my therapy practice. After the first few interviews, I got the hang of it and ended up really enjoying it. Through the podcast, I have offered listeners free tools such as meditations and self-care worksheets, as well as the opportunity to sign up for my online course. Producing and hosting the show is a lot of fun, and it's also a lot of work. I've definitely learned to get help from others, like my sound editor, as well as to keep organized and pace myself. It has definitely been an unexpected adventure.
Thanks so much for listening. I want to thank Cosmo Palms for editing this podcast and Brianne Rising for taking great care of our guests. Huge thank you to Asher, Bianca, Kelsey, Marielle, and Nick. I so appreciate you sharing your stories. And remember, if you want to apply for Create Your Program, head over to rebeltherapist.me/create. I'll see you next time.